Here we go. Today's class is on women and Chanukah. I thought this was, and if we weren't going to have a class today, I was going to do it like in the next few days. Like I would say, how about tomorrow? How about Monday?
Class?
No, I don't. I'm not able to get out in the evening, so it's hard for me. But so today's class is about the role of women in Chanukah, in the Chanukah story, and in the observance of Chanukah. And these two things are connected. Okay, so as we'll see. So basically, this class can be summed up in one sentence. Okay, women are involved in the mitzvos of Chanukah because, as per Rashi, quote, the miracle of Chanukah was brought about by a woman. Okay.
I've never heard that.
Yeah. I had a feeling that it might be new, right? So, okay. So how was the miracle brought about by a woman? Now, really, in addition to the story of the miracle being brought about by women, there's the second story. There's two stories about women in Chanukah. Okay, two stories about women in relation to Chanukah. One is the story that Rashi references when he says the miracle took place because of a woman, and that story. Sure, whatever. Yeah, thanks. And that story is the story of Yehudis, which we'll talk about. And there's a second story about a woman relating to Chanukah, and that story is not so much about the miracle taking place through a woman, but it is a story that shows the dedication of women in this difficult time and how they were self-sacrificing and trusted in God, etc. And that's the story of Hannah and her 7 sons. Have you heard of this story? Mm-hmm. Have you, Barbara? Mm-hmm. Yes, Hannah and her 7 sons? Okay, so the story of Hannah and her 7 sons, it first appears in the book of Maccabees 2. Now, the book of Maccabees 2 is not Jewish canon, which means it's not one of the books that is officially part of the Torah writings, what we call the Ksuvim, the writings, right? So the canon of Jewish writings was established much earlier by the Anshe Knesset Agdola, and this is a book that was written after that, so it wasn't canonized. It's not officially in the canon, but it is a lot of these what's called apocryphal books, books of the Apocrypha. They are accepted as historical documents rather than as divine documents. So the story of the Maccabees 2 was apparently takes place in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, which is the time of the Greek-Syrian rebellion that is in the time of Chanukah. The mother is unnamed in this book, and she's portrayed as a heroine who instills a sense of courage and self-sacrifice to God in her 7 sons. So the story is like this.
So how did it get associated with Hannah then?
I'll let you.
Okay.
Sorry. That's okay. This woman is the Hannah that we're talking about. Yeah. But in the first version that we have of the story, her name isn't Hannah. Her name is actually in the first version of the story. She's an unnamed woman. She later becomes Hannah, and I'll tell you how. Anyway, the story is that during the reign of Antiochus the Fourth, this woman is brought in front of the king with her 7 sons. She had 7 sons ranging in different ages, and the king, for whatever reason, is angered with Hannah and her 7 sons because they won't eat pork, and he brings them in front of the court and tries to force them on punishment of death, to eat pork. That's the original story. In the later version that we know, you may have heard in the different version that the issue is worshiping idols, but we'll get to that a little bit. But in the first version, the king wants the sons to just eat a little pork. Now, in reality, on pain of death, we're allowed to eat non-kosher foods. There's only 3 mitzvos we're not allowed to transgress if someone threatens our life. But basically, if our life is threatened, we're allowed to transgress everything.
The rabbi was captured, and the thieves took him to their den and said, "Rabbi, you have to eat this pork chop." Mm-hmm. And he said, "I can't." Mm-hmm. And they said, well, if you don't, we'll kill you. And he said, oh, well, in that case, I'll take two.
Yeah. Yeah, right. But it's true. We're allowed to, God doesn't want us to die for the mitzvos. He wants us to live by them. So we're allowed to really transgress almost everything in the Torah except three major mitzvos we can't transgress. And that would be worship, killing, murder, and sexual improprieties. Okay. So here he's saying, eat pork. And the boys still say, the first boy comes in front of him and says, no, I'm not going to do it. I'd rather die. And he is tortured. His hands and legs are cut off. It's really a very gory story. And his hands and legs are cut off. And he's then boiled alive. And basically dies, obviously, because of that. So it's a really nice, gory story. But the boy shows his dedication to God and his mitzvos. And his mother is very proud of him. And while he's being boiled in this pot, the mother and the other sons are talking to each other, giving each other, chizuk, encouragement, support. Don't worry, God will, we have to die nobly, etc., etc. Each boy comes before the king, and the king says, just eat this pork and I'll spare your life. Each boy insults the king, chastises him. You think you're so great. God is great. You're just so mortal. We will live after. We're giving up our lives, but God will give us life in the afterlife. That sort of thing. And they go to their death nobly. And one after the other, the boys are tortured. Are asked, "Will you eat pork and save your life?" And they refuse. And they each chastise and make fun of the king. At the end of the story, the seventh son is brought before the king. And the king at this point fears that he is being humiliated in front of his whole court. In other words, if all seven sons die, it's going to be known that Antiochus couldn't beat these little boys. So he says to the mother, listen, tell your boy to save his life. I don't want to kill him. Tell him to save his life. So the mother says, okay. And they say, okay, bring me my son. When her son comes over, she whispers to him, more encouragement, right? So she's fooling the king. She's not going to give in. She's going to encourage him to give his life up for the sake of heaven. She also tells him things like,
this is the last son.
The last son, the very last youngest son. And she says, God created heavens and earth. It wasn't created out of nothing, and people were not created out of nothing. Don't be afraid. Be worthy of your other brothers, etc., etc. She scarcely finishes speaking, and the youngest kid says, "Come on, what's the holdup already? Take me off. I want to die." He's like, "No, what's the delay?" There's no question that these sons are going to waver. They're really strong, and so of course again, and he gives the longest chastisement of the king, and he goes off to his death, and of course the king treats him worse than the others, and he dies, and then they put the mother to death also. Okay, so this is the story that is mentioned. This is from Maccabees too. The story is now there has a second mention in the Talmud. Okay, it had there or it's either the same story or it's a different version of this. It's either a different version of the same story or it's a different woman. But there in Talmud Gittin, the Gemara
take your shoes off, please.
tells the story of how, and in this version of the story takes place in Roman times, about 200 years later. In this version, the woman's name is Miriam. Still didn't get to Hannah yet. But the story is a little bit different. There, the emperor, or the Caesar, as it were, he asks them to serve an idol rather than eat pork. Okay? So in other words, that's the story as we know. The story is told today. It's told about the seven sons who refuse to bow down to the idol. That's what he wants. The king wants the boys to bow down to an idol. Yeah, sure.
But they're saying that the Hanukkah story, it was to bow down to an idol.
Right. Yeah.
So the Talmud was after the Book of Maccabees?
Right. Much after. The Talmud was written much after, and they placed the story even after the Hanukkah time. Okay, why we'll get into in a few minutes, but the differences are, like I said, the king asks the sons to bow down to an idol. Now, this is a situation where you have to submit rather, be killed rather than submit and bow down. When it comes to, and in addition, another difference in the story is that the boys instead of giving these long-winded speeches insulting the king, they simply quote Torah. They quote a mitzvah. So when the king says, bow down to the idol, the first one says, it's written in the law, I am Lord your God. Okay, and the second one says, it's written in the Torah, you should have no other gods before me. So they're using Torah verses, in other words, to chastise the king rather than their own. Okay. I'll call you back. At the very end of the whole ordeal, the youngest boy comes before the king. And the king, again, interestingly enough, doesn't want to have the humiliation of these boys are beating me at this. So he says to the boy, look, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put my seal on the floor. All you have to do is pick it up, bend down and pick it up, and we'll call it even. We'll say that you did what the king wanted, but at the same time, you're not going to lose face. I'm not going to lose face. Okay. But Rashi says that the seal had the image of the king engraved on it. And therefore, by stooping down to pick it up, he would make it appear as if he is worshiping the image, right? So that was the challenge for him. Could he pick it up? Yeah, probably you could make an excuse and say, and certainly the king wanted to make it easy for him, right, to be able to pick it up and not have to die. But the youngest son, of course, says, no, I am not going to do it. And they're leading him away, and the mother says, give him to me, that I just want to kiss him. And the mother, she kisses him, and she says also to him, my son, this is the youngest son, go to your father Avraham. In other words, when you're in heaven, go to Avram Avinu, our ancestor. Tell him, you sacrificed one son on the altar. I have 7 altars. I sacrificed 7 sons, in other words. So that's her story. Okay. And then there's a similar story in Midrash Echarabah, so another Gemara story, that names the mother of the 7 sons Miriam bat Nachtam, a widow. There it also takes place in the time of Caesar. And there it also says, in this story also a major difference is that after her sons die or are killed, she goes up to the roof and throws herself off. So she commits suicide. Okay, in Midrash Echarabah as well. She fell off a roof, which means that she threw herself off a roof. Okay? Now, so back to your question, where does the name Chana come from? The name Chana comes from the story that is told, again, in the late 10th century. So that's much, much later now. By a man named Yosiphon, not Josephus, who was a famous historian of the Jewish people, but a man named Yosiphon, living in Italy. He wrote a history of the Jewish people, and there the story is similar to the one of Maccabees too, and it takes place in the time of Antiochus, but she is called Chana. So that's really the first mention of the story with the woman named Chana. Why?
Really stupid question.
Yeah.
Chana?
Oh, interesting. That could be a connection, although it's not mentioned by anybody as a reason. But that's a very good. That's a good theory. There are other theories that seem more likely to a little different. One of the reasons that people have, they say that the reasons for him changing the name to Chana is that because there's a reference in his story, Yosiphon's story, to a prayer that was spoken by Chana, the person who was the mother of Shmuel Hanavi, Samuel, right? So we had a class on Chana, how she was the one who innovated the Amida, the Shemona Esrei, or at least she's the one that the Chachamim say we based that tefillah on.
Like the way we pray.
Right, yeah. The way we pray the Amida, she said it silently, etc., and even the format of the prayers that she said. So in Yosiphon's story, there is a reference to one of Chana's prayers. She says, "My heart exults in Hashem." That's from the story in Shmuel Aleph, the story of Chana. So therefore, the suspicion is that he named her Chana to make that connection to Chana. And then there's another connection to that Chana, there's another, in the story of Chana, in Shmuel Aleph, it says the barren woman bears 7. So there's the thought that perhaps he was trying to make the connection to Hannah in the Shmuel story, in Shmuel Aleph, very strong. Of course, the connection would be that the ideological connection is that here are two women who suffer because of children. Hannah, the original Hannah, is suffering because she doesn't have children, and she's praying to Hashem, and her faith is strong. She has that whole conversation with God. You remember we talked about how the back and forth, well, really just her to God, challenging God and challenging him and saying, look, I trust in you. You give me children, I will dedicate them to God, etc., etc. So she has a very strong faith and a personal relationship with God. And so this woman in the story, the Greek story, also shows that sort of dedication to God. And so that's an idea of why Yosiphon renamed her Hannah. But in any event, the story comes down to us as Hannah and her 7 sons. Now, it's entirely possible that more than one story like this actually happened, right? In other words, because you could ask, well, when did it really happen? Did it happen in the time of the Maccabees, or did it happen? Did it happen later? Because the Gemara story references a time that's later in Roman times. And the truth is, this was an example of perhaps typical persecution by the rulers to the Jewish people and the Jewish mothers. So it's entirely likely. But in any event, it's a representation of how women were victimized by Antiochus. And it is an important story. We accept it as sort of, written history or oral history as to how women were persecuted. All right, that'll be important later on when we talk about why women are included in the mitzvos of Chanukah. Now, the second story is the story of Yehudis. Are you familiar with the story of Yehudis? Okay, so this is the story that Rashi is basing his comment on as to why women were, why the miracle came about through a woman. It's through this woman named Yehudis. So the story of Yehudis also comes down to us from a book of Apocrypha, a different book called the Book of Judith, okay, the Book of Yehudis. Here's the story. So the time of the Syrian Greek occupation of Judea, the Greeks were wreaking havoc on all of the countryside. They were banning mitzvos. You couldn't do a bris. You couldn't keep Shabbos. They were erecting statues, Greek statues all over the countryside. They were erecting altars to Greek gods. They were forcing the Jews to sacrifice to those gods. They were forcing Jews to sacrifice pigs in the temple. So it was a very, very tough time. And of course, you had rebellions, of the most famous of which was the Maccabee rebellion. Anyway, Holofernes was a Greek general, Syrian Greek general. He was the head of a huge army, and he was very notorious for cruelty and suppressing rebellions.
What was his name?
Holofernes. Holofерnes. And he was determined to crush a rebellion in the town of Basulia, okay, in Judea. So he besieged the town and he starved them out. He cut off the food and water supplies, and he was going to wait them out. The townspeople gathered and demanded that the leaders do something about this. They want them actually to surrender, because otherwise it would mean the death of all the people in the town. Uzziah, who's the leader of the town, says, just let's wait 5 more days. He was hoping that there would be some miracle that would help. Now, Yehudis stands up in this meeting. She's noted as the daughter of Yochanan, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. And she's a widow. She's known as a devout woman, very respectable. She stands up and addresses Uzziah, and she says, let's put our trust in Hashem. Never give up, because surrendering is worse than death. Uzziah says, okay, you're right. I agree with everything you're saying, but what can we do? And she has a plan. She says, you know what? Let me leave town with my maid. I'm going to go to Holofernes. And the men are shocked. You're going to risk your life to go to Holofernes and get your head cut off. And she says, look, it happened once before that a woman saved the Jews. She's referring to Yael. Yael is the story in Shoftim, Judges, that talks about how she killed the Canaanite general Sisera, or Sisera in English. And she drove a tent stake through his head. So it was a very similar saving. The Canaanite generals were trying to suppress rebellions in Judea, and Yael, in the story of the Navi, saves them. So she says, it happened once before, let me have a chance. All right, so she takes her maid, she takes a big basket of rolls, goat cheese, and wine, and she leaves the city and she goes to the camp of the army camp, which is, camped outside the city, waiting. So she goes to the Holofernes' tent. She says, I have a message for Holofernes. And she goes to him and she says, look, I want to help you capture the city because the situation is very dire. The people are starving. The people are suffering. They can't hold on much longer. I want you to be, in exchange for me helping you, you'll have pity on us, right? I want you to take over the city. I want you to be able to save the city by taking it over. In other words, she doesn't want to see, she says, the destruction of the people and of the town because of their stubbornness. So she says, here's what I'm going to do. Listen up. She says, once we run out of kosher food, we're going to have to start eating our non-kosher animals, right? The horses, the donkeys, whatever. Once that happens, she says, the people of the town will be spiritually vulnerable because God will be angry with us. Now, again, as I mentioned before, it's not really true. If you have to save your life, you have to eat whatever you need to eat. But she says to Holofernes, their spiritual defenses will be down because they're eating non-kosher food. And there is something in that, of course. We know that, we have this concept that if we put non-kosher food in our body, we're somehow tainting not only our bodies, but our souls, and more importantly, our souls. Not really tainting our bodies, but you're tainting your soul. So she says, once they start eating non-kosher food, they'll be spiritually vulnerable. God will be angry with them, and that's when you can attack. That's when they'll be at their weakest, and you can attack. So I'm going to come and go from your camp to the city, and I'll find out when they're starting to eat non-kosher food, and then I'll come back and tell you. Holofernes sets her up and her maid in a tent of their own, and they have the freedom to come and go as they please. And she goes every day to the guards at the wall, and she finds out what's going on. And eventually, Holofernes is getting a little bit antsy, says, what's going on already? I want to attack. And she comes back and she says, yes, this is the time. In a day or two, they're going to be completely ready and vulnerable to attack because they're now starting to eat non-kosher food. So that's it. Get your men ready. Holofernes is overjoyed, and he says, we're going to make a celebration, just you and me, Yehudis. So that evening, she says, I want to contribute to the party. She brings the rolls and her goat cheese, and she feeds him the cheese, which is thirsty making, right? It makes you thirsty. And when he gets thirsty, then she feeds him the wine, and he gets drunk, and he falls asleep. And she says a prayer to God about how, just as Yael, God strengthens Yael's hand, please help strengthen my hand. And she takes his sword and she decapitates him. All right. She wraps his head up in her shawl, puts it in the basket, leaves, because she has the freedom to do that. She tells the guard, whatever, he's sleeping, don't bother him. She takes her maid and she walks slowly out of camp, just like it's any other day. And she goes into the town and she shows Uzziah and the townspeople the head, and they say, now's the time to attack, and they attack and they win. So this is considered a major victory here in the battle of the Jews against the Greek Syrians. All right. So again, the book is from, Yeah, she was. But more so than just badass, she's shown to be, no, it's fine. She's shown to be a righteous woman, right? She's shown to be someone who acted from pure motives and with complete trust and faith in God. And that's what gave her strength and her badassery and her success came from there, of course. So the text was again, this text that's apocryphal means that we don't include it as one of the divine texts that we have, but it is, so it's not considered the story is not. The story is still considered part of our tradition, there we have a lot of the original. As I said, the original text is written in Hebrew, but the original text is lost, and we have a lot of Greek translations. And some of most of the translations of that book, the story actually takes place a little bit later, rather earlier, in the times of the Persian Empire, which is the First Temple period. The Chanukah story is Second Temple period, and there's some theories as to why the author might have placed this author might have placed the story in the Persian period. And it could be that the author didn't want to anger the Greeks by publishing basically this rousing. It was meant to be a rousing and encouraging book supporting the rebellion. So he may not have wanted to do that. But it's also possible that the story did take place twice, because there's a midrash that dates back to the time of Gaonim that does record the entire story in the context of Chanukah without naming the heroine. But in any event, the discussion is important because the book of Judith is not part of our written tradition. The story of Yehudis definitely is. And again, it's used as the basis, as I said, for the position that the women were included in the Chanukah miracle. Af hein hayu ba'oso hanes. Also, they were included in this miracle. And the story of Yehudis is that proof of that idea, that they were involved in the miracle. And again, it's important regarding how they're obligated in the mitzvos. So Rashi, again, going back to Rashi, says the miracle, as I said, the miracle was brought about by a woman. So he gives Yehudis direct credit for the miracle of Chanukah. Another idea of how women were included in the miracle is that this is according to Rashi, is that they were subject, first of all, they were subject to death and annihilation just like the men were, right? I mean, the Greeks threatened the lives of the Jews, and that meant the lives of all the Jews, men, women, and children. But in addition, Rashi points out there was another reason that the women were particularly subject here to the hardships of the Greek-Syrian rule. And that was the gezerah, the decree that came down from the Greek governor that said that all women, if they were going to get married, in other words, if they were engaged to be married, the day before their wedding or a couple of days before their wedding, they had to go to the Greek governor and sleep with him. He would have what was called first night rites. And this was apparently not just, yeah, right? This was apparently something that not only, I guess, the Jewish women were subject to, but because they were being oppressed by the Greeks, and they were subjected to their rule, the Jewish women were also subject to this. So it was a terrible gezerah. It meant that a lot of women couldn't get married if they were engaged to a Kohen, because a Kohen cannot marry a woman who's had relations with a non-Jew. I mean, it's a terrible, terrible gezerah. So that's what Rashi says, the two reasons that they're included in the miracle, that they actually caused the miracle, and that they were included in the horrible persecution that the Syrian Greeks did to them. Rabbeinu Nissan, so we have other Chachamim who also agree with Rashi that this is the case. Rabbeinu Nissan adds the detail of the name of the person, of this woman, saying that this is the daughter of Yochanan the Kohen Gadol. And there's again a little more discussion in the Tosafos about whether or not Af Hein Ba'oso Hanes means that they were actively involved or just that they were beneficiaries of the miracle. In other words, there's some commentary about, well, maybe it just means that they benefited from the miracle. But no, the Rashbam says they were active participants. And again, he further identifies Yehudis as the heroine of the Chanukah story. Okay, so there is plenty of discussion and plenty of acknowledgement that Yehudis is the heroine of the Chanukah story. Because of her, the miracle of Chanukah came about. Now there are some objections to including the story in the Chanukah tradition, but the objections really don't have to do with the question of whether or not the story happened, but rather that it's probable the story happened much earlier in history, and therefore why should we include the story in the Chanukah story when it's really took place much earlier in Persian times. However, these commentators say, well, even though it's not part of the Chanukah story, we commemorate it on Chanukah. Okay, so it's an example of the dedication of the Jewish people and the Jewish women especially. It's, as I said, firmly part of our tradition. Now, how are women affected on Yom Tov because of this? Okay, so there are three halachic areas in which the question of we have a question of women's participation, or the issue of women's participation. Area number one is candlelighting, lighting of the menorah. Okay. The second area is saying Hallel. And the third mitzvah would be refraining from work while the candles are burning. Have you heard of that? That women do not work while the candles of the menorah are burning?
The rabbi put it in the...
Yeah, he did. He put it in. That's right. Okay,
The
so...
Hanukkah candles are burning?
That's right. Okay.
But only some work. You can't do laundry, you couldn't do...
Right.
But other stuff you can do.
Right, okay, so I'll get to that.
Specific.
Well, that's right. So let's take the first halachic area, the first mitzvah, the lighting of the menorah. Okay? So there's a discussion in the Gemara about whether someone who is not obligated in the mitzvah of Chanukah lights, in other words, not obligated to light the menorah, can they light candles anyway? Okay? And then in that discussion states, women can certainly light candles because they were part of the miracle. Okay? Now, so they can light the candles. The Shulchan Aruch writes explicitly that a woman is obligated in the mitzvah, and therefore she can light. Okay. So because again, the mitzvah took place because through a woman, she's absolutely obligated in the mitzvah of menorah. Okay. And then we have another commentary that says that because it's clear that she can light, because she's obligated to light, therefore she can even light on behalf of others. Right? So for example, she does this already. We have a halachic concept that two people who are equally obligated in a mitzvah can each perform the mitzvah for the other. For example, Kiddush, Friday night, right? A woman is obligated to hear Kiddush, and a man is obligated to hear Kiddush. Because they have an equal obligation, the man can make Kiddush and cover the woman. She could be what's called Yotze. She can be exempted from doing it herself if the man is doing it on her behalf. Same thing when it comes to Havdalah, right? The woman actually performs a mitzvah for the man on Shabbos also, and that's in the lighting of the Shabbos candles. Men and women are both obligated in lighting the Shabbos candles, but only women do it. Mm-hmm. The same concept applies. Because they have equal level of obligation, she can perform the mitzvah on his behalf.
So do single men light the menorah?
Shabbos candles? Absolutely, yes, they have to. Mm-hmm.
And
Single,
Kiddush.
huh?
Single woman
has to make Kiddush. Absolutely, right. It's by the same logic, by the way, that is one of the reasons that a woman cannot be included in a minyan, because she is not obligated in minyan. So if she's not obligated in minyan, that means that she can't take the place of a man in the minyan, and it's the same logic, because if you don't have the same level of obligation, then you can't do the mitzvah on someone else's behalf. But here, because a woman is equally obligated in the mitzvah of Hanukkah lighting, she can do the mitzvah for other people. Okay? It's traditional, though, that the head of the household does it, right? But at the same time, so the Mishnah Berurah says that if others are lighting in the house, women are not required to light. So she can be covered by her husband's lighting or her father's lighting, but they can certainly light if they want to, right? Because they have equal obligation. And there's also some discussion as to whether or not she has to light, because the Mishnah Berurah says that they cite this concept called ishto kegufo. A wife is like his body, meaning that a wife is part of the husband's body. So therefore, the logic goes, if he's lighting, she doesn't have to light because he's lighting for her. Others question this and say that doesn't really make sense. If she's still obligated in the mitzvah, that means she should be encouraged to light. There's lots of different minhagim as to if you're a married woman and your husband is at home, does she light? Doesn't she light? She certainly can, And there's some households where everybody lights, including the wife. Every single person in the household, including young children. If you drive by down the streets of the neighborhood, you'll see multiple menorahs in a house, for example. And that's because just every child lights. And in that case, the woman can light if she wants to, right? So single women, as we said, single women and widowed women or divorcees are certainly obligated to light for themselves. If they're married and their husband is at home, he can light for them, or they can light as well. If your husband is not home, if you're married but your husband is not home, then the woman has to light as well. All right.
But you can light for your husband.
Yes, exactly. Odds are that he'll probably want to light where he is anyway, or maybe he's not going to get home in time.
But
So
if
yeah.
he's home
Oh
with
yeah.
You could still light.
Yeah, you could, but traditionally the man of the household lights. But in other words, if you have a family of people lighting, then to have him not light, it would the idea is the head of the household does it, and then everyone else can do it as well. Just like the head of the household makes kiddush and Havdalah, and just traditional to do it that way. So that's lighting the menorah. Okay, so now we come to the second area, which is Hallel. So Hallel is a special prayer that we say on Yom Tovim, on holidays, right? We do say Hallel on Chanukah. And so there's a little discussion about whether or not women are required to say Hallel. Now, there's a discussion about whether or not, in general, women are obligated to say Hallel, because Hallel is a time-bound positive mitzvah. And remember that most time-bound positive mitzvos, women are exempt from, not obligated to, which means they could if they want, most of them, not all of them, right? But this is an example of one of those situations. So there's a discussion about whether or not they are exempt from reciting Hallel. So Tosafos discusses this and says, well, they're not really obligated to do it, but except they're obligated to do it on the first night of Pesach, because on Pesach, women were included in the miracle. In other words, they were saved, right? In the Exodus, they were saved. So therefore, they should really say Hallel on the first night of Pesach. By this logic, though, right, and this is something that Reb Shimon Sofer brings up, he says, by this logic of Tosfos, if they were saved from the miracle of the Exodus, and therefore they have to say Hallel on Pesach, certainly Chanukah, the same logic applies. They were saved in the miracle of Chanukah. According to Rashi, the miracle was brought about through a woman, so therefore they should be obligated as well. Okay, so they should be obligated to recite Hallel on Chanukah. And if they're obligated in the lighting of candles, right, then they certainly are also obligated in the saying of Hallel, because of the same logic. They were either beneficiaries of the miracle, or they helped the miracle to happen. Okay, and so again, like any time-bound positive mitzvah, is something that women are encouraged to do. Even though they may be officially exempted, but they were included in the miracle. So people will say that if you're going to shul, certainly you should say Hallel, and if you can remember to, it's a good idea. Okay, so that's the second mitzvah of Chanukah. The third mitzvah of Chanukah is refraining from work while the candles are burning. So what is this all about? So the source of this minhag is that one should not do work while the candles are burning. And this would be both for men and women, and to also maybe try not to do work not only during the time the candles are burning, but in general on Chanukah. But a different opinion holds this just applies to women. This minhag only applies to women. And the Shulchan Aruch codifies this minhag that women should not perform malacha while the candles are burning. What are the reasons for this? Okay, so we go back to our original reasons. Number one, because the miracle was brought about through a woman. And number two, the fact that they were specifically targeted as part of the persecution, as we mentioned, with the first night rites thing. And so therefore, we do have the minhag, the tradition, the custom, that women should not work. And then going back to what you said, there are certain activities that are discouraged at this time. Applies to activities such as sewing and mending. Cooking would be permissible, we need supper on the table,
What
right?
man would have said that can't be done?
right. So, right. Okay. And the Mishabur also writes that the reason for the minhag is to establish that one should not benefit from the light, because we have this rule that you can't use the Hanukkah menorah lights for any other purpose, right? You can't read by it, you can't do work by it. So therefore, to sort of confirm or to establish that rule, we refrain from doing work. So we shouldn't even give the impression that we're using the Hanukkah lights, and we shouldn't come to possibly using them. So that's the Hanukkah lights, the working during Hanukkah lights. Any questions? That's basically what I got. Yeah.
You said
Yeah.
not that they think about it, expanded, not only while the lights are burning, but for the whole holiday.
Some opinions hold that we shouldn't really work on Hanukkah if you can get away with it, or if you can refrain from it, then you should. It's one opinion out there. It's not traditionally certainly, if that were the case, we wouldn't be able to have school. Teachers wouldn't be able to teach, but we don't have this. We don't follow this way of doing things. But it's like one of these ideas that it's what we call muhudar, mahadrin, extra, special observance. But I don't personally know anybody who refrains from all work during all of Hanukkah. Again, that's a big drain on. I mean, it's a strain.
Mm-hmm. Well, what if you? Another question. What about people who might be visiting you that aren't Jewish, and you want to include them in lighting a menorah? Can you do that?
Well, I mean, if they're there when you're lighting the Hanukkah menorah, I don't see a problem with it. We have a halacha that says that we are not allowed to invite non-Jews to our Yom Tov meals or for Yom Tov holidays. So, for example, whereas in contrast, I might be able to invite a non-Jew to my Shabbos table, there is a specific mitzvah, a law that says I should not invite a non-Jew and Jewish person to my Rosh Hashanah lunch or Pesach Seder. Okay. But this is Hanukkah. This is not. We don't have a set seudah. We don't have a meal like we do have a meal on Purim. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about, just as you said, having them stand there while you light candles. I don't see a problem with it. Although you should.
But them lighting.
Them lighting. Oh, they absolutely. Well, having their own menorah.
I mean, if we have provided, I have a million menorahs. So
right. Oh, I don't know. That's a good question that I don't know if I have an answer to, because I never thought about that situation before.
It would seem harmless.
Yeah, just like when you have non-Jewish guests, oftentimes they follow us into the kitchen.
Right.
Yeah, right.
Maybe not say it,
Right.
but like when in Rome.
Right. I don't know, because I would ask your rabbi. I really don't know the answer to that. I would hesitate to give an answer to that.
Can I ask a reformed rabbi?
Ask. I don't get involved in that. Let's turn that off.